there is a letter that survives. It was written at 2 o'clock in the morning by candlelight in a cold castle in the English countryside. The woman writing it had not slept. She would not sleep again. She wrote to her brother-in-law, the King of France. She told him what was going to happen in a few hours. She described what she wanted done with her belongings after she was gone. She asked him to pray for her. And then she wrote these words: "I am to be executed like a criminal at 8 in the morning." She signed her name. She set down her pen. She folded the letter and sealed it. Then she went to prepare herself for what was coming. Her name was Mary. She had been a queen since she was 6 days old. She was 44 years old when she wrote that letter, and she had spent 19 of those years as a prisoner. She had been a queen of Scotland and a queen of France. She had been married 3 times. She had survived plots and rebellions and accusations of murder. She had escaped from a prison on a Scottish island by disguising herself as a serving woman. And in the end, none of it had been enough. This is her story. It begins in winter. December 1542. Linlithgow Palace, Scotland. A place of cold stone and draughty corridors, and the particular bleakness of a Scottish winter pressing against every window. Mary of Guise, the French wife of the Scottish King James V, gave birth to a daughter in Linlithgow Palace on the 8th of December. The baby came early and small, and there was the usual anxiety of the period about whether she would survive, which small babies often did not. She survived. 6 days later, her father died. James V of Scotland was 30 years old. He had been ill, devastated by a military defeat at the hands of the English, and he died of what the chronicles call a fever, but what may have been something closer to despair. He had wanted a son. He had needed a son in the brutal calculus of 16th-century kingship, because a son meant continuity, meant strength, meant that the dynasty would hold. When they told him his wife had given birth to a daughter, he is supposed to have said something that has echoed down the centuries. He referred to the royal Stuart dynasty, which had come to power through a woman, a daughter of Robert the Bruce. And he said, quietly, toward the end, "It came with a lass. It will gang with a lass. It came through a girl. It will end with a girl." He was not entirely wrong, but the ending was much longer and much stranger and much more devastating than he could have imagined. His daughter was 6 days old when she became Mary Queen of Scots. Scotland in 1542 was a country balanced on the edge of several disasters simultaneously. It was caught between England to the south and France to the east, in a web of alliances and hostilities that had been building for generations. The English King Henry VIII had broken with the Catholic Church and was pushing Scotland toward the same Reformation that was sweeping through Europe, dividing families and kingdoms along the fault line between the old faith and the new. Scotland was predominantly Catholic, but the Protestant movement was gaining ground, powered by preachers like John Knox, who believed with the absolute certainty of the converted that the Catholic Church was an abomination, and that anyone who supported it was doing the devil's work. Into this world, the baby queen had been born. She was crowned at 9 months old in a ceremony at Stirling Castle. Tiny and incomprehending, dressed in robes too large for her, she was anointed and crowned while the men around her debated what to do with her. Because a baby queen was a political asset. She could be married, and through her marriage, alliances could be made and kingdoms could be connected, and power could flow in whatever direction the marriage pointed. Henry VIII wanted to marry her to his son Edward. He wanted Scotland absorbed into England through this marriage, the two kingdoms united under English dominance. When the Scottish regents who ruled in Mary's name rejected this proposal, Henry did something characteristic. He ordered his armies into Scotland. He burned and pillaged and terrorized the Scottish lowlands in a campaign that history calls the rough wooing, a phrase that captures perfectly the particular English combination of violence and entitlement. The Scots looked to France for help, as they had always done. France sent troops, and France proposed a different marriage for the baby queen. Mary would come to France. She would be educated at the French court. She would marry the French king's son, the Dauphin Francis. Scotland and France would be united. England would be contained. Mary was 5 years old when they put her on a ship and sent her to France. She would not see Scotland again for 13 years. The French court was the most sophisticated place in Europe. It was also one of the most dangerous, full of beauty and culture and brilliant conversation, and underneath all of it a permanent current of intrigue, of faction, of people trying to advance themselves by destroying everyone around them. Mary thrived in it. She was quick and charming and beautiful in the particular way that the 16th century found beautiful, tall and graceful with reddish auburn hair, and a face that portrait painters clearly enjoyed painting. She learned French as naturally as if she had been born to it. She learned Latin and Greek and Italian and Spanish. She learned to dance and to ride and to play the lute and to write poetry in multiple languages. She grew up alongside the French royal children, particularly the Dauphin Francis, who was a year younger than her and who adored her with the uncomplicated devotion of a boy who has found someone he wants to be with always. Francis was not robust. He was sickly and slight, and would never be the kind of king that France needed in that turbulent century. But he loved Mary genuinely, and that was something. She was educated by some of the finest minds in France. She read widely and thought carefully, and held her own in conversations that would have defeated most adult men of the period. A French scholar who knew her wrote that she spoke Latin fluently and with elegance, which in the 16th century was a significant thing to say about anyone, let alone a teenage girl. At 15, she was considered ready for marriage. The wedding of Mary, Queen of Scots and Francis, the Dauphin of France, took place in April 1558 at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. It was one of the great spectacles of the 16th century. Mary wore white, which was unusual, white being the French color of mourning. She wore it deliberately, because white suited her coloring. She was defying convention because she could, because she was young and beautiful, and at that moment the future seemed to hold nothing but brightness. The crowds lining the streets of Paris went wild for her. She was their Dauphine. She was Scotland and France united. She was beautiful and young and dressed in white. She was 15 years old, and the world in that moment was entirely hers. It did not last. It lasted less than 2 years. Henry II of France, Francis's father, died in a jousting accident in 1559. Francis became king. Mary, at 16, became Queen of France. For about a year she was queen of 2 kingdoms simultaneously, Scotland and France, the most powerful woman in Europe, possibly in the world. Then Francis died. He was 17 years old. He had been ill throughout his short life, and in December 1560 the illness that had always been waiting for him finally arrived. An ear infection, the records say, that spread to his brain. He died in agony with Mary at his bedside. She was 18 years old. She was a widow. She was no longer Queen of France, because the throne passed to Francis's younger brother Charles IX, and Charles IX's mother Catherine de' Medici had her own ideas about who would hold power in France, and a young Scottish widow was not part of those plans. Mary of Guise, Mary's mother in the region of Scotland, had died that same year. In the space of a few months, Mary had lost her husband, her mother, her position in France, and most of her future as she had understood it. She had to go back to Scotland. She had not been there since she was 5 years old. The Scotland that Mary returned to in 1561 was not the country she had left. In those 13 years, everything had changed. The Protestant Reformation had swept through the country with the ferocity that John Knox brought to everything he did. Knox was a man of absolute convictions, which is a polite way of saying that he believed he was right about everything, and that anyone who disagreed was not merely mistaken, but actively wicked. He had been writing pamphlets with titles like The First Blast of the Trumpet against the monstrous regimen of women, which expressed his view that female rule was contrary to God's law, nature, and common decency. He meant Elizabeth of England and the Catholic rulers of Europe when he wrote it. He got Mary, Queen of Scots, into the bargain. Knox met Mary shortly after her return to Scotland. The meeting was not comfortable for either of them. Mary was Catholic, deeply and genuinely so. Knox was Protestant with the intensity of a man who had spent time as a galley slave for his faith. They argued about religion in a way that was unusual for the period, with Mary holding her own against one of the most formidable polemicists in Europe, making points he could not easily dismiss, challenging him in ways he found disturbing. He wrote about her afterward. He admitted that she had upset him in ways he could not fully explain. There was something about the combination of her intelligence and her conviction and her composure that he found difficult to handle. He resorted, eventually, to criticizing her weeping, which was the 16th century equivalent of telling a woman she was being emotional. Mary governed Scotland with more skill than the men around her gave her credit for. She was tolerant in a century that had no framework for tolerance. She allowed Protestant worship to continue without harassment. She attempted to manage the competing factions of Scottish nobility with a combination of charm and firmness. But the Scottish nobility was not manageable, not really, not by anyone. Mary needed to marry again. A queen without a husband was a political problem in the 16th century. She needed an ally, a protector, someone whose position would strengthen hers. She needed, most urgently, a son. She chose Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. It was, by almost every measure, a catastrophic choice. Darnley was tall and handsome, and that was approximately where his virtues ended. He was vain, weak, jealous, prone to drinking, capable of real cruelty, and entirely without the political judgment that the situation required. Mary seems to have been genuinely attracted to him, which is one of the great ironies of her life, that the one time she chose a husband for personal rather than political reasons, she chose so badly. They married in 1565. Within months, the marriage was in serious trouble. Darnley was jealous of Mary's friendship with her private secretary, an Italian musician named David Rizzio. The friendship was almost certainly innocent, whatever the rumors said. But Darnley, whose jealousy was the kind that didn't require facts, decided that something had to be done. On the night of the 9th of March, 1566, Darnley and a group of Protestant nobles burst into the room where Mary was having supper with her ladies and several attendants, including Rizzio. They dragged Rizzio away from the table. Mary was 6 months pregnant. She watched as her husband's men stabbed her secretary 56 times. 56 times. She did not break. Or rather, she broke privately and composed herself publicly, which was something she had learned to do and which she would need to do many more times before the end. She was 23 years old, 6 months pregnant, and she had just watched a man she liked be murdered in front of her by her husband's associates while her husband watched. She never forgave Darnley. Her son James was born in June 1566. She held him up at his baptism and said something that the witnesses recorded and that has stayed with history. She looked at her son, and she said that he was so much her son that she hoped all men would recognize him as such. It was a pointed reference to the rumors about Rizzio, a public assertion of the child's legitimacy. She said it with composure, in front of the assembled nobility of Scotland. Whatever she felt, she did not show it. Darnley was sick by early 1567. He was staying in a house in Edinburgh called Kirk O' Field, recovering from what was described as smallpox, though some historians have suggested it was syphilis. On the night of the 10th of February, an explosion destroyed the house. Darnley's body was found in the garden. He had not been killed by the explosion. He had been strangled. Who killed him has never been definitively established. The prime suspect was James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell, a powerful Scottish nobleman who was tried for the murder and acquitted, probably because nobody dared convict him. Mary's role has been debated ever since. She almost certainly did not order it. She may have known more than she admitted. She was certainly relieved to be free of him. 3 months after Darnley's murder, Mary married Bothwell. This was the decision that destroyed her. It doesn't matter at this distance exactly what happened between Mary and Bothwell. What matters is what it looked like. A queen whose husband had been murdered, marrying the man widely believed to have committed the murder, 3 months after the body was found. The Scottish nobility, which had tolerated a great deal, decided it had tolerated enough. They rose against her. An army confronted her forces at Carberry Hill in June 1567. Bothwell fled. Mary surrendered, believing she was surrendering on terms that would allow her to keep her throne. She was wrong. She was imprisoned in Loch Leven Castle on an island in the middle of a Scottish loch, impossible to reach without a boat. She was 24 years old. While imprisoned at Loch Leven, she miscarried twins. She never recovered her health fully after this. She signed papers abdicating in favor of her 1-year-old son James. Her half-brother, the Earl of Moray, became regent. The crown she had held since she was 6 days old was gone. She escaped from Loch Leven the following year. A young man named Willie Douglas, sympathetic to her cause, stole the castle keys while the jailer was at dinner, smuggled Mary out in a boat, and locked the castle gate behind them with the stolen keys and threw the keys into the loch. She raised an army. She marched south to face the regent's forces. She lost at Langside in May 1568. She had been free for 11 days. She made the decision that would define the rest of her life. She would go to England. She would throw herself on the mercy of her cousin Elizabeth. They were both queens. They were both women in a world run by men. Elizabeth would understand. The ties of blood and gender and the solidarity of monarchs would protect her. She crossed the Solway Firth into England by fishing boat on a May evening in 1568. She was 25 years old. She would not be free again. Elizabeth I of England had a problem. The problem was Mary. Elizabeth had never met her cousin and rival. They had been corresponding for years with the careful courtesy of two people who are circling each other across a chessboard. Elizabeth was cautious by temperament and brilliant by intelligence, and she understood with absolute clarity what Mary represented. Mary was Catholic. Elizabeth was Protestant. To English Catholics, many of whom considered Elizabeth's claim to the throne illegitimate because her parents' marriage had been disputed, Mary was the rightful Queen of England. She had a genuine blood claim through her grandmother Margaret Tudor. The Pope had declared Elizabeth a heretic. There were Catholics in England who would have welcomed Mary on the throne. To allow Mary to go free was to allow a rival claimant to the English throne to wander around Europe looking for an army. It was not something Elizabeth could afford. To send her back to Scotland was to send her to her death. The Scottish Protestant lords who had deposed her would not allow her to live if she returned. To keep her in England was awkward and expensive, and a permanent political headache. Elizabeth kept her in England for 19 years. 19 years is a long time to be a prisoner. Mary was moved from castle to castle, always in the English Midlands and North, always under guard, always with a keeper whose job was to watch her and report everything she did and said to Elizabeth's ministers. The most famous of these keepers was George Talbot, the Earl of Shrewsbury, who kept Mary for 15 of those 19 years and whose household was essentially consumed by the task. The conditions of her captivity varied. Sometimes she had a relatively large household of her own servants. Sometimes she was kept more strictly. She was never allowed to travel freely, never allowed to communicate openly, never allowed to meet Elizabeth, who refused every request for a personal meeting throughout the entire 19 years. She was ill frequently. The years of imprisonment and the damp English castles and the stress of her situation attacked her health steadily. She developed rheumatism that made moving painful. She grew heavier as the years passed and exercise became difficult. Her hair went gray and she began wearing wigs. But she did not give up. She embroidered, endlessly. The embroideries that survive from her captivity are extraordinary works, complex and beautiful, full of symbols and messages encoded in imagery for anyone who could read them. She kept dogs, small ones that she loved extravagantly. She wrote letters, hundreds of letters, to Elizabeth and to European rulers and to her supporters in Scotland and France, always trying to negotiate some change in her situation, always failing. She intrigued. She could not help it. She was a queen by nature as much as by birth, and queens did not simply accept their imprisonment. She corresponded secretly with Catholic sympathizers in England and Europe. She was involved in various plots to put herself on the English throne or at least to escape from captivity. Elizabeth's minister Francis Walsingham was one of the most effective intelligence operators of the 16th century. He knew about most of the plots. He was, in some cases, actively encouraging them, because a Mary who was openly plotting treason was a Mary who could be legally killed, and Walsingham wanted very much to kill Mary. In 1586, a young Catholic gentleman named Anthony Babington organized a plot to assassinate Elizabeth and put Mary on the throne. Walsingham knew about it. He allowed it to develop. He intercepted Mary's correspondence, read her replies in which she appeared to endorse the plan, resealed the letters, sent them on, and waited. When he had enough evidence, he moved. The Babington plotters were arrested and executed with extreme brutality. Mary was put on trial for treason. The trial was a travesty by any legal standard. Mary was not allowed proper legal representation. The evidence against her consisted largely of letters that had passed through Walsingham's hands and may have been altered. She was not permitted to see the specific evidence being used against her. She was a foreign queen being tried for crimes allegedly committed against a crown she did not acknowledge as legitimate. She defended herself brilliantly. She was calm and composed and legally precise, pointing out the procedural irregularities, denying the specific charges, questioning the reliability of the evidence. She was 43 years old and had been a prisoner for 18 years, and she stood in that hall and argued her case with the eloquence of a woman who had been trained in the finest courts of Europe. It made no difference. She was found guilty of treason. Elizabeth hesitated. Even now, even after everything, she hesitated over signing the death warrant. She was being asked to execute an anointed queen, something that had never been done in European history. She understood what the precedent meant. She understood what it would look like. She signed the warrant and then immediately tried to recall it, sending messages suggesting she hadn't quite meant to sign, that the execution shouldn't happen yet. Her ministers ignored her. Whether this was what she actually wanted is a question historians have argued about ever since. On the 1st of February 1587, Elizabeth signed the warrant. At 2 o'clock in the morning of the 8th of February, Mary sat at her desk and wrote her last letter. She had prepared. She had known this was coming for months. She had used the time to put her affairs in order, to write letters to everyone she needed to say goodbye to decide what she wanted to happen to her belongings. She had chosen what she would wear. Underneath the black dress she wore into the hall at Fotheringhay Castle, she wore red, crimson red, the Catholic color of martyrdom. She was making a statement with her body when she could no longer make one with her words. Whatever they were doing to her, she was choosing how to meet it. She had brought her dogs with her, the small ones she loved. They were hidden under her skirts and robes because she would not leave them behind. The hall at Fotheringhay was draped in black. A scaffold had been built in the center of the room, 2 feet high. About 300 people had gathered to watch, the local gentry and officials, people who had come because this was history and they knew it. Mary walked in with composure. She was described by everyone present as calm, not the calmness of someone who doesn't understand what is happening, but the calmness of someone who has made her peace with it. She was helped to kneel at the block. She prayed aloud in Latin. The executioner asked her forgiveness, as was custom. She said she forgave him and all those who wished her death, with all her heart. She laid her head on the block. The executioner was a man named Bull. He was the best in England. He was nervous. The first blow missed her neck and struck the back of her head. The second blow cut through the neck. The third severed it completely. He reached for the head to hold it up for the assembled witnesses, as was done. It fell. He was left holding a wig. Mary Queen of Scots had been wearing a wig. Her hair beneath had gone gray with the years of imprisonment. The head rolled across the scaffold. He picked it up by the gray hair and held it up. The witnesses stood in silence. Her lips moved. For 15 minutes after the severing of her head, her lips moved. And then from beneath her skirts, her dogs crept out. They had been there through everything, hidden in the folds of her clothing. They would not leave her. They sat beside her body on the scaffold and refused to move. They had to be carried away. The aftermath was strange and complicated, in ways that suggest everyone involved knew they had done something that could not be undone, and were not entirely comfortable with it. Elizabeth, when she received the news, wept and raged. She claimed she hadn't wanted it to happen, that her ministers had acted without her full authority. Whether this was genuine grief or political performance or some complicated mixture of both is impossible to know. She was wearing the ring Mary had sent her years earlier, a gesture of kinship and appeal, when she heard the news. In Scotland, Mary's son James VI reacted with what appeared to be controlled calm. He had not seen his mother since he was 10 months old. He had grown up under the influence of the Protestant lords who had deposed her. He was 19 years old and he had a kingdom to run, and his mother's death, however tragic, also meant the removal of a complication. He negotiated. He protested diplomatically to Elizabeth. He did not break with England. When Elizabeth died in 1603 without a direct heir, James became King James I of England. He was the child Mary had held up at his baptism, the child she had given everything for, the child who had been taken from her when he was 10 months old. He had her body moved from Peterborough Cathedral, where she had been buried initially, to Westminster Abbey. He gave her an elaborate tomb near the high altar. He had Queen Elizabeth's tomb moved to a less prominent position. In the inscription on Mary's tomb, he gave her all her titles: Queen of Scotland, Queen Dowager of France, Queen of England. Queen of England, the title she had never held in life. Mary Queen of Scots has never faded. Something about her story keeps people coming back to it, has kept people coming back to it for 400 years. She has been the subject of plays and poems and novels and films and operas and ballets, more than almost any other figure from the 16th century. Part of it is the tragedy of the waste of it. A woman of genuine intelligence and ability and courage, given every possible disadvantage by the accident of her birth and the time she was born into, destroyed not by her own failures alone, but by the forces arrayed against her from the moment she drew breath. A world that would not let a Catholic queen survive in Protestant Europe. A world that would not let a woman govern without a husband, and then destroyed her for the husband she chose. Part of it is the specific images that have lodged themselves in the imagination. The baby queen, the girl in white at Notre Dame, the prisoner embroidering behind her locked door, the woman in red walking into the hall at Fotheringhay, the wig, the dogs. And part of it is that letter. Written at 2 in the morning, the candle burning, the castle cold and quiet around her, the words set down with a hand that did not shake. I am to be executed like a criminal at 8 in the morning. She wrote it down, she folded it, she sealed it. And then she waited for the morning to come. It is late now, wherever you are. Mary Queen of Scots has been gone for more than 400 years. The castles where she was imprisoned are mostly ruins or museums. The world she lived in is so distant from ours that it requires real effort to bridge the gap. And yet the letter survives. The actual letter in her actual handwriting in an archive in France, the ink faded but the words still legible. 2 in the morning, 8 in the morning. The hours marked out with the precision of someone who knows exactly how much time she has left and has decided to use it to say what needs to be said. She was a queen from the day she was born. She tried to be a good one in circumstances that would have broken most people. She made mistakes, serious ones, and she paid for them with everything she had. She walked into that hall in red. She forgave her executioner. She laid her head down. Sleep well,